Happy Book Week, Shaftesbury Park. It's so great to see you virtually, and I hope that you've been having an excellent book week so far. I'm here to share a lovely story with you from County Durham, and it's called The Weardale Fairies. So, here we go. There was a wayward young girl who lived in Stanhope up Weardale, and one day she took into her head to go off by herself, gathering primroses outside the village along the riverbed. It was a foolish thing to do, for the hills above the river were full of hollows and caves, and everyone thereabouts knew that these were riddled with the hostelries and dancing halls of the fairies. Even in broad daylight, it wasn't long before the child heard eerie music playing on pipe, fiddle, and drum. The tune was so wild and hauntingly exquisite that she found it quite impossible to ignore. It spun into her head and giddied her around it, until she was compelled to hurl down the bunch of flowers she was clutching and hurry towards it. Madly, she stumbled through the bracken stumps and brown heather and came soon to a gigantic boulder jutting from the hillside. Running down its center was a gaping fissure. By now, the music was almost deafening. No longer could she hear the wind and the curlews crying. It was so frenzied that the girl couldn't keep her feet from tapping. Her fingers twitched and her head began to nod uncontrollably. Young as she was, she knew that she must tear herself away, for fear of being lost to this world forever. Yet, to the pull of the music was too strong for her. "Don't look, come away," she cried to herself, but in spite of her fear, she pressed her face to the crack and peered through it. Beyond it, in a thick darkness lit by a mass of flickering, smoking candles, she glimpsed a sight that few have ever seen. More than 80 minuscule people, perfectly formed and richly dressed, yet each no bigger than a hand width, dancing around the cavern like a swarm of angry bees. If the crack had been wider or the girl smaller, she would have squeezed through it for sure, but luckily that was impossible. Somehow she managed to wrench herself away. Scattering her flowers, she ran back down the valley and along the riverbank until she reached her home. "Whatever's wrong?" her mother asked when the girl came lurching indoors, for her hair was all disheveled and her face as white as a sheet. "I've seen them," she whispered, "the little people." Weeping and trembling, she told all that had happened. "You're safe from them now." The mother tried to comfort her, but when the father came in from the field, all her terror came seething back, for he certainly didn't agree. "They didn't see you spying on them?" he quizzed the girl. She confessed that she didn't know. "Then we must assume that they did," he said gravely, "and that means, oh, my precious daughter, we've as good as lost you." "How can that be?" she cried. "They'll come for you," the father answered. "Haven't we told you enough times, you foolish child? The little people can't bear to be spied on. They'll snatch you away as soon as they can." Dear. "For pity's sake, ask the wise woman if she can help us," the mother urged him. The father nodded gravely and hurried out through the twilight to a lonely cottage at the far end of the village, covered in twisting briars and tendrils of ivy. He knocked at the door and was beckoned inside by a very old woman. He told her all that had happened. The old woman stared into the flames of her fire. Then she turned to him and said, "They'll come for her tonight, I reckon, at midnight." "But surely this must be some way to save her," he exclaimed. "Oh, indeed there is," she said, "and it's simple enough, yet harder than you might think. For the fairies won't be able to touch her so long as your house is totally silent. However, should they hear even the slightest whisper, they'll snatch her away." The father was somewhat comforted. He rushed home and sent the girl to bed at once, strictly forbidding her to call out or cry out or make any kind of noise. Then the parents went around the house together. They extinguished the fire to be sure there would be no crackling or shifting, jammed all the clocks so that they could not tick, and overfed the dogs and the cats until they all fell into a deep, satiated sleep. Finally, they bolted the doors tightly and sat down in the cold kitchen to wait. After a while, though the clocks were all still, they guessed it must be midnight, for they heard the sound of high-pitched, reedy voices and the clinking of bridle bells and the soft clip-clopping of shrunken hooves. A whole troop of fairies came riding into the yard, but the door was shut firmly against them. The mother and father sat still and quiet as corpses, scarcely daring to breathe. But, however much care one takes, something always slips through. When the girl had gone upstairs to hide in her bed, the youngest dog, hardly more than a pup, had sneaked up with her, missing out on the feast they had sent all the others into slumber. Now he lay at the foot of her bed with one ear cocked. When the fairies opened the gate, he began to growl as if they pranced around the yard. This turned into frenetic barking. The parents looked at each other in horror and went running up the narrow stairs to the room where they had left their beloved daughter. But it was too late, for the protective spell had been broken. The bed was empty. The child was gone. The mother wept bitterly all night, but the father went straight back to consult the wise woman. She took her head when she heard what had happened, but passed no judgment. Instead, she said, "It's still not too late to save your daughter if you dare to visit the fairies' cave yourself." "Of course," the father cried, "anything." "When you go, you must take them 3 gifts, the wise woman went on. "Firstly, something that gives light without burning. Secondly, a piece of an animal's body which you have taken without shedding even a drop of blood. Thirdly, a chicken that has no bone in its body." "But what does this mean?" the father cried. "My heart is broken. How can you expect me to solve these riddles?" "Look, and you will see," the old woman answered. "Listen, and you will hear. And wherever you go from now on, carry a rowan sprig with you, for it has power to protect you from malicious enchantments." Then she showed the father to the door and shut it firmly behind him. A spreading rowan tree stood by the wise woman's garden gate. The father broke a twig from it and put it in his pocket. Then he set off morosely along the road to his home. His thoughts were all befuddled, and he wasn't looking where he was going, so he didn't see the ragged tramp in his path until they collided. The father offered his apologies, and to make amends, pulled a silver sixpence from his pocket and pressed it into the tramp's grubby hand. The tramp stared at him with sunken eyes, then beckoned him closer. "My fault too," he said. "If I take this money, I owe you a favor in return. Is there something I can do for you?" The father shook his head sadly. "I don't suppose you can solve a riddle for me," he said. "Can you tell me what gives light without burning?" The tramp laughed. "That's easy for a man of the road like me. The answer is a glowworm. I often use one to light my way. Here." He reached in the hedgerow, scooped up a small beetle that shimmered with the luminescence so soft it could scarcely be seen, and pressed it into the father's hand. "Whatever you need it for, I hope it works," he said, "and may good luck be with you." They went their separate ways. As the spring sunshine bore down, the father noticed a movement in the grass. A bronze-colored lizard was struggling to free itself from a twisted wire. He crouched down to free it. As the lizard scurried away, its tail came off in his hand, leaving neither wound nor blood. "Ah," he thought, putting the tail in his pocket, "that's the second riddle solved too." He continued on his way. In a copse by the roadside, he heard a great squawking. Parting the branches, he saw a thrush besieged by a kestrel. Quickly he found a pebble and hurled it at the larger bird. As the kestrel flew up and away, the thrush broke into a sweet song, and in the purity of its notes, he seemed to hear these strange words. 3 days by 5 days, on egg sits hen. chick within, no bones by then. He hurried home and told his wife all that he had seen and heard. Luckily, one of their hens was already broody, so they set her to sit upon a new laid egg straight away. When 15 days had passed, the father took the egg from her nest and added it to the glowworm and the lizard's tail that were already in his pocket. Then he set off to the fairies' cave. He trod the path his poor lost daughter had followed along the river bank. Like her, he caught the strains of eerie music and was drawn to the boulder on the hillside, where a crack marked the entrance to the fairy realms. His anguish was enough to banish his fear. Holding the rowan twig firmly in his hand, he roared out above the deafening music, "Give me back my daughter!" At once the music stopped. In the heavy silence that followed, he put his eye to the fissure and saw the girl. She was dressed in her nightgown as when he had last seen her, but she was pale as bones now and held firmly in the grasp of a dozen minuscule hands. A ready voice called, "What will you give us to get her back, mortal?" "I bring you a life that it does not burn, part of a creature's body taken without shedding blood, and a boneless chicken," the father answered. He crammed the curious gifts through the crack, pushing hard until he heard each one drop to the floor of the cave. There was a burst of crackling laughter and a flash of light, and then the crazy music started up again. In despair, he turned away, thinking that, after all, he would never get his daughter back. But then, there she was, standing right behind him, safe, alive, and free. The end. I hope you enjoyed this lovely story, and I hope that you have an amazing rest of your book week. Bye-bye for now.